wanted to open up this portion of the broadcast with our Southeast Regional Director, Attorney Robert Patillo. He has been engaged in a number of things in Georgia, including voter suppression, anti-voter suppression legislation, march to the polls. Throughout this pandemic, he's been working with us on interpreting the stimulus package. And this stimulus package is going to be more far-reaching than the previous one. And we wanted to make sure that all of our not-for-profits and faith leaders were aware of the nuances of it, what the deadlines are, and what the opportunities are that exist within the stimulus, what I call stimulus 2. So Attorney Patillo, if you could share with us.
So one of the most important things for people to understand between last year's stimulus and this year's stimulus is who is eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program. So the people who qualify is any entity that's been affected by COVID-19, that's a sole proprietorship, independent contractor, self-employed person, as well as a small business who meets the SBA small business standards. Any business that is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, 501c19 veterans organization, tribal business under Section 31B2C or of the Small Business Act that has at least 500 employees. Any business that is NAICA code certified, and also churches that have a nonprofit wing. Now, the PPP cannot be used for the ecumenical services because that will violate that separation of church and state that we always talk about. But any non-ministerial services that are part of the nonprofit for a church will be covered under the Paycheck Protection Act. Now, they have extended the deadline for applying. Originally, the deadline was the end of March. They've extended it to May 31st of 2021. So if you have not gotten your application in, you should get that application in expeditiously if possible. In order to apply, you apply directly through your bank or your lending institutions. Just as with last year, we have found this year that people have had more success with smaller lenders because the large lenders, of course, are being swamped. So your Chases, your Wells Fargo, they have so many applications that if you're applying through a community bank, through a Black-owned bank, through a credit union, often that information is processed more quickly. Additionally, your personal banker is going to have a financial incentive to get your loan processed and get your loan through because banks get about a 4% kickback on the loans. So they want to help you get these loans. So they want to help you get the documentation. Now, when it comes to documentation, because a lot of people get scared when it comes to documentation, particularly dealing with the federal government, don't be afraid of those things because particularly if you're a small business or a sole proprietorship or a small church or a small nonprofit, the documentation requirements are far less onerous than they were previously. So you should talk directly with your banker in order to determine what exactly your qualifications would be and and what you need to have on hand. But primarily, you're going to want to have a 12-month income profit and loss statement on hand to show what your payroll was for the previous 12 months. Additionally, how much the difference was between 2020 when COVID hit and 2019 prior to that, how much of your money is going towards payroll and covered and qualifying expenses that I'll cover in a couple minutes, and then a clear accounting what's going on. The reason for this was that in round one of the PPP program, there were tremendous amounts of fraud. So we saw things like Shake Shack getting a PPP loan, which it was not intended for. Ruth Chris was getting PPP loans. We saw other individuals would get PPP loans. I think there was a rapper here in Atlanta who bought a Lamborghini with his loan, and he is currently headed towards federal prison for that reason. So the reason these documentation requirements are in place isn't just to be onerous on the individual, but to ensure that the money is that this finite amount of money is getting to the people who need it and not simply being squandered and wasted. So once you talk to your community bank, you want to make sure that you get your documentation together for your application packet. So that's going to include your profit and loss statements, the amount that you're requesting in the PPP, what your monthly bills are, your covered billing expenses. Now, PPP can be used to cover everything from mortgage expenses, capital costs, utility expenses that are associated with the business or the nonprofit nonprofit, as well as incidental fees, as long as you are documenting them properly. So proper bookkeeping is definitely going to pay off right now in this in the application process for these loans. Now, when it comes to the repayment, this is where some people get confused and some people get in trouble. I'm going to give you a resource that people can go to. Is sba.gov/funding/COVID-19. sba.gov/funding/COVID-19, and that takes you to all the rules for the PPP program that will explain to you how to apply and all the rules for repayment. One thing for people who are sole proprietors who are applying for the PPP loan, there is a fast track process for you. So if you are a sole proprietor without additional employees, you're simply trying to keep a hair salon or a barbershop or a accounting business that you do where you're the only employee, you can go to www.womply.com, WOMPLY.com, and that has a fast track application that only takes about 30 minutes to fill out, predicated on you being a 1040 sole proprietor, where you simply put in your 2020 tax information. It takes about, as I said, 15 to 30 minutes to apply for it, and you usually have your determination back in about 30 days. If you are a larger organization, then you can expect a more involved application process with your bank, and then you can also expect it to be about maybe about a month to 6 weeks before you get a determination back as to if you have been approved for funding. So on the issue of repayment, if you do not meet the criteria for forgiveness of the PPP loan, because as most of us know, the PPP loan converts to a grant. That's the beauty of the program, that you borrow this money, but if you meet the criteria set out by the statute, then it turns into a grant that you don't have to pay back. So it turns into free money, but the government wants to make sure that you're actually using it for the right purpose first, and that's why they put this process of applying for forgiveness in. They have not set out the statutory deadlines yet for when you need to repay them, but that guidance will be coming down the line. But what they will be looking for is very clear documentation on how you have used the funds. So once you receive the PPP funding, you do want to make sure that you're keeping every receipt, every virtual payment, every credit card statement available, so that you'll be able to clearly articulate to the government that you have used the funds for the proper purposes, including payroll, including mortgage debt, including utilities, and those sorts of things. As I said, this is the abbreviated version because it can get very long and technical. We do ask people that if you do have any questions, feel free to email me at rpatillo@rainbowpush.org. If you need more additional resources, you can go directly to your bank or to your loan provider. Also, SBA.gov is an outstanding resource where they have a clearinghouse of information, as well as videos and tutorials where you can find out information on the application process and also work towards your goals of getting that funding. With that, I will turn the floor back over to Reverend Wilson.
Bishop Grant needs to share with all of you our housing project, which is a national initiative. And it's very important that this month is the anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, 1968. And one of the things that Bishop Grant is going to talk about is our project at Concordia, and how each of you need to look at what is happening with HUD housing and see the parallels, similarities that is occurring in your community, in your city, where poor people are living in certain kinds of conditions.
The basketball rims don't have nets on them, they took them off.
At the beginning of Women's History Month, Reverend Jackson was alerted by Rainbow Push Coalition National Field Director Bishop Tavis Grant and National Youth Director Reverend Cameron Barnes of complaints of mold, mice, lack of repairs, and proper management at Concordia Place Apartments, affecting the lives of women and children.
We shouldn't live like this. A dog live better than this.
We found certain patterns that we found to be quite disturbing.
Reverend Jackson and staff acted immediately and arranged meetings with Capital Realty Group officials and HUD officials to discuss the problems and find some possible resolutions.
You need to be treated with dignity and respect, and we need to resolve these issues. HUD, I'm here today because we're committed to it.
What we supposed to do? It's not right. It's not right. It's not fair. It's like you said, you don't go home to rest. Your kids not crying. Your kids is not sleeping in the bed with you. And they scared. It's not right. But I want you to tell me what you gonna do with this. Hello. What you gonna do with it? What you gonna do with it? What you gonna do with it? What you gonna do with it?
I know what it is, and I'm very sorry. I know what it is, and I'm very sorry.
Tell them about the maintenance men
Walking
coming.
in my house while I'm naked, and I have them on camera saying that the management said that they can. I had no notice, no letter, because I'm always prepared when they're ready to come in. I'm always at home, and somebody always in my house, and I have 4 girls and 1 boy.
You're the problem. I think HUD needs to convene the next meeting, because if they don't mean HUD sign, it may mean nothing. That's how HUD is in the equation, right? So it's just blowing off does not help us at all.
In closing, to what the Reverend was referring now, we will do what it takes, whatever HUD wants us to do. The plan was to do the inspections, not do any remediation. Before we do remediation, have HUD decide, and as the Push Coalition decide the right way of the remediation. The plan is just to do the inspections, besides for the today's exterminating and the mold, which is obviously 2 crucial things.
As many of you all know, this pandemic has exacerbated all levels of unemployment, uninsured, those who don't have access to capital and have access to medicine and appropriate health care. So our work here at Concordia is very significant to raising quality of life and restoring the dignity of people.
Tenants were given the great news during the Saturday meeting that thus far, the laundromat is now open on weekends. There is no longer only one way in and one way out of the apartment complex. Previously, a child died due to non-access to the complex. If cars were towed during the snowstorm, everyone will have their $220 refunded. Because of the list of demands, there will be a mandatory inspection of the 297 units at Concordia Place. Each tenant will be given 48 hours notice before the inspection begins. Rent calculations will be reevaluated. Playground will be open. Basketball nets will be restored so the courts can reopen. Grills can be used. The Rainbow Push Coalition and the tenants will work together to ensure that real change is gonna come. Reverend Jackson is now calling on a rent strike being organized until repairs are made to remove mold, rodent infestations, and replacement of new appliances.
I appreciate you all for coming out to support us in this fight that we've been having at Concordia Place Apartments to get livable conditions. And we thank you for your continuous fight and continuous help. We really appreciate it because we have hope now. Because at first we didn't have any hope, but now we do have hope, and we thank you so very much.
This is our next step to finally getting something done.
I like the new improvements that they finna start having. I hope they take the no parking signs down so we can park.
Hopefully everything is going to be updated soon and we can see change.
I'm glad that we've come together as a community to get things in order, and I'm here for the change.
Those of you who are participating on this platform, we certainly appreciate your time and your presence as we are endeavoring to keep hope alive. April 11th marks the anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968 to fix residential segregation by preventing individuals from marginalized communities from being discriminated against in the sale or rental of housing. Several dynamics have impeded and created great impediment for this to be actualized. One is the Great Recession, the other is the housing crisis of 2000s, and the current COVID pandemic, which all three have hit Black homeowners harder than any other racial group, entirely wiping out middle-class wealth at epidemic proportions. Black Americans are more likely to be isolated geographically and concentrated racially. The health gap, the educational gap, the employment gap, and the wealth gap between white families and Black and Latino families continue to increase as we pursue all and every measure to bring about a true sense of perfection in our union. There has been a great failure in achieving fair housing, and that is because the Fair Housing Act has the mandate of both preventing new discrimination and reversing the damage brought by the federal government itself. So there are three dynamics to this as we look at the Concordia Place incident. One is persistent unaffordability. The coronavirus pandemic came to the US and forced individuals into crisis level housing with tremendous affordability issues, especially for low income households. In 2019 alone, there were well over 38 million households with what we call housing cost burdens, spending 30% or more of their income on housing. This represented 40% of all households nationally. 1 in 7 households, 17 million in total, were severely cost burdened by the pandemic and by the economy. Renters were more cost burdened than any other group, with 46% of renters cost burden compared to 21% of homeowners. And so now we know why the stimulus was so effective in not only just rescuing homeowners, but providing rental assistance and a moratorium on eviction. Cost burdens were greatest amongst low-income households, particularly for Black and brown persons. The second factor is the growing nature of racial disparities. One of the challenges that Reverend Jackson has confronted is the persistent and growth in significant disparities in housing. Chief among these is the racial gap in home ownership. The gap between households of color and white households continues to grow in exponential manners. The gap is now more than 40%, the largest gap since 1983. While white household ownership increased slightly in the past several years, Black home ownership has remained flat, just at 40% for the past 10 years. So home ownership rate is significant to improving one's economic ability and coupled with access to capital. Number 3 is a widespread housing insecurity. The economic fallout of the pandemic and other crises combined with ongoing housing unaffordability puts millions of renters and homeowners at risk at losing their homes. Despite various policy protections for renters and homeowners enacted during this crisis, housing security remains the most tenuous challenge for many going into 2021, particularly renters and homeowners of color. Low-income individuals are victims of high prices, redlining, and pricing them out of the communities that they so desire to live in. And so there are several dynamics that Reverend Jackson's been leading in the Concordia Place apartments located here on the south side of Chicago. There are 300 families, and within that demographic represents 1,300 people, including women and children. And several things Reverend Jackson was able to accomplish. One, affording residents the right to organize based upon federal requirements and federal regulations given out by the Housing Development of the United States. And so developing a housing tenant association. And furthermore, engaging with Rainbow Push as members and supporters as we not just fight for them, we fight with them. These tenant meetings led to videos and testimonials, unit visitations, engagements, tenant petitions, letters and calls from elected officials, and Rainbow Push, along with HUD and the Tenant Association and Capital Realty, have now been working in a community covenant, and several things have been accomplished. One, a new garbage contract, which afforded residents the highest level of sanitation service, given the nature of this pandemic, that it breeds on areas where sanitation is low and exposure is great. Reverend Jackson was very effective in advocating for reimbursements to residents. There were well over $10,000 in towing fees that were given back to residents whose cars and automobiles were towed, what we felt was unethical and immoral in the midst of a snowstorm. Recreational areas were open. Open bans on recreational activities like barbecuing and grilling were lifted. Access to the laundromat 7 days a week. Exits in and out, which afforded residents, particularly working residents, opportunity to have access to transportation, particularly public transportation. Access to the common area where there now be children activities, daycare, screening, and workforce development. Formal talks have been created by Reverend Jackson between HUD and Capital Management, where grievances and allegations of sexual harassment have been formally addressed, and they've created, that is Capital Realty, a zero tolerance policy as it relates to sexual harassment. And now there is a 100% mandatory inspection of all units in this housing complex. And so it's significant for us to understand the quest and the challenge that is coupled with the crisis of this pandemic, of us fighting for the poor rather than fighting the poor. And I would hope that you would go to our website, www.rainbowpush.org. I would hope that you would call us here in Chicago at 773-373, Freedom on your dial. Hit us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as we are keeping hope alive. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Jeanette Wilson.